Welcome back to another edition of Worst to Best. This is where I take a look at one artist or band and kind of rank my favorite albums of theirs. Now, I of course need to preface this, as with all, these are my personal opinion, these are my favorites, this isn't necessarily their best or worst, these are just my own list of what I like to listen to from this artist. It gives you a little bit more information about my tastes within a particular band, gives you a little bit more grounding on how I approach music and which ones I like. So let's dive into Pink Floyd's, and we'll start off with arguably their worst. More, their soundtrack, the first one. This one's a little weird for me. It definitely felt like it was the blending of the two ideologies of Pink Floyd at the time. Early Pink Floyd from like Saucer Full of Secrets and Piper at the Gates of Dawn, and like mid-early Pink Floyd, like we're talking about everything from Amagama right up to, I guess, Obscured by Clouds, and the ideologies don't quite mix all that well. It's one that I've listened to a number of times and just can't get into the music. It's a little bit... It's not even all that experimental, it's just kind of bland, unfortunately. It definitely feels more like a soundtrack than a studio album. So in that sense, that's why I put it at their worst. Okay, so I'm only looking at the studio side of this. I know that the live performances on this are dripping with brilliance. Saucer Full of Secrets, Astral Domi, all of these songs on the live version, just brilliant. I'm only looking at the studio work. And the studio work needs some work. Even the band has noted that they had no idea what they were doing on this. And when a band splits an album up with just the artist that's performing, you do run the risk of losing that special spark where all the people come together. This is one of the reasons why Works didn't quite work on Emerson, Lake and Palmer, but it did kind of work a little bit with Yes's Fragile. But what Yes did on that sense was that they came together and still were able to kind of piece it together as a whole unit. Didn't quite work here. Now, the reason why I didn't put this as the worst album is because it still has a number of really brilliant moments on it. I mean, the end piece of The Narrow Way, it's so good it doesn't even deserve to be on this album. Like, it's a lost gem, and just David Gilmour's orchestration and construction of music. Now, I will admit, Sisyphus starts off the album with a really meaty organ sound. It just kind of fizzles out into a weird trip that I don't even really want to be on. And Roger Waters' editions of the Grantchester Meadows and the several species of small animals gathered together in a cave and groove. Like, what the hell is that? What is that? That is just ridiculousness, and not in a really good way. So yeah, this album is a little bit all over the place, and it's mainly because the band didn't quite know what they were doing. So let's move on. And hold on to the dream. Now, the reason why the final cut in my mind is so low is because it isn't a Pink Floyd album. It's a Roger Waters album. Like, Richard Wright isn't on this album at all. In fact, he left. Like, he did not like what happened with him in the predecessing album, so he's just like, guys, I'm gone, I can't take this anymore, this isn't a Pink Floyd project anymore. Like, David Gilmour really isn't featured on this album at all. Like, he's here and there, but it's really straight up Roger Waters, and that's part of the reason why I like the music on here, and it's conceptually a stronger album than some of the other ones that we'll be talking about, but I mean, overall, it does suffer because it's not an inclusive album. Now, I do like the concept a little bit better than other conceptual albums that the band has done. It's a lot more straightforward than, say, The Wall. The music itself, in terms of the production, is one of the best albums because it was one of the first times that it would actually like start off into like the top right corner and then go back into like the bottom left. Like, you would have this kind of weird soundscapes going on. It's just they didn't really do too much with it, and it never really had that moment. So, and it also has a really strange kind of stop and start that I just can't really get on board with. The narrative flow does kind of tinker out a little bit, so it does suffer a little bit because of that. Okay, so if the final cut was a straight up Roger Waters album, the Momentary Lapse of Reason is more of a David Gilmour album. Now, at least David Gilmour was playing a little bit more with Nick Mason, but again, Richard Wright isn't actually credited on here. He plays a little bit, and he did tour with them, but he still wasn't a part of the band. And there's that whole backstory with Roger Waters being like, you can't be Pink Floyd if there's only two members, and I'm like, well, dude, it wasn't really Pink Floyd when you were at the helm. But anyway, putting that aside, it did suffer with just, I don't know, it didn't really do anything for me. The music on here is not quite as realized. It's a lot more safe, and that's a word that I never thought I would put to a Pink Floyd album, being safe. Outside of like a few tracks on here, it's mainly forgettable. Like A Momentary Lapse of Reason is definitely an apt title for this work, because I don't know, it's a momentary lapse of memory for me. Let's just get on to the next one. Okay, so the first album from them, Piper at the Gates of Dawn. This album started it all off, and I mean, I have to give it credit for being so early as well. Like 1967, I believe this guy was released, and there was like very little of this type of music out there, and such amazing tracks on here that really push the limits of what music can do, like Astrodomi and Interstellar Overdrive being that 9-minute just and that end where it's just like it just but it did suffer an identity crisis, because you had these like two ideologies going on with the band. You had that experimental acid rock, trippy, out of this world space rock, and then you had like these weird poppy, accessible, again trippy music like Bike and Scarecrow and Gnome. It just was like, what is this? And I know that's Syd Barrett just tripping out all over the place, but at the same time, it weakened the album because it didn't have this full-on identity that it did with like the next album from them, Saucer. But yeah, I mean, it's still a fantastic trip, and this is where we're getting into the quality of Pink Floyd. So let's continue that. Okay, so it's kind of funny, right? We went from the first album, and we're going to the last album. Now, why did I rate An Endless River so high up there? Being that, essentially, The Endless River is just the deep cuts from the recording sessions of The Division Bell. Well, in my mind, the band still had this unifying concept and unifying spirit. It was a celebration, essentially, of life, and it was one of the more uplifting albums that the band has put out. It was celebrating the past. It's definitely celebrating those who had left us, like Richard Wright, who left us, unfortunately, and I think this is really who this album is dedicated with, because it's so keyboard heavy. There's very little bass solos or guitar solos. A lot of it is just the purely synthesized soundscapes, and I love albums like this. It's a grieving process, and we're grieving with it while also celebrating the life, and it's one that I will still go to and thoroughly enjoy. Okay, so the second soundtrack from these guys, Obscured by Clouds. A lot of people might be wondering why it's so high up here, even though it is a little bit of a mess. And it is. Like, even the band has admitted that this album was cut a little too harshly. There's a lot of really strange moments on this album. I believe it's Childhood End or Free 4 that, like, you're about to crescendo and it's just like, and I'm like, well, that was a little weird. But you do have just some outstanding and beautiful tracks like Mudmen. The title track of Obscured by Clouds is a very amazing little bit of a trip. But the one that I cannot help but love is What's the Deal? And this guy is like David Gilmour's masterpiece. I love how intimate it is. I love how clean it is. It's not like overly experimental. It's not like overly complex and crazy. It's just a heartfelt song. It also has a very unifying essence as well. Like, it's not like More, where it was just kind of all over the place. The band was starting to develop that essence of who they were at this time, because they were suffering a little bit of a identity crisis, and they were kind of doing a lot of start up and goes. And this was the one where I think they found it, but they didn't know what to do with it. So yeah, it's one that I still love and one that I still go back to. Okay, let's talk about one of the trippiest albums that the band has ever done, Saucer Full of Secrets. This guy is just a trip. You have such standout tracks. Like the title track is one of my favorites of them. I love just where this guy goes. It's a perfect example of what I like to call the chaotic resolution, where it's just chaos, you're all over the place, you don't know what's going on, but it ends on such a brilliant stance. Like, I love the resolution that you have on this track, and I love how this album opens up with Let There Be More Light, with that little bit of that bass line kind of grooving us in, and then once we come into that like full-on sound, it's just that wow, 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 and then when we come into that chorus, that wow, I love that. I love that. We still have some strange Barrett songs. Remember a Day and Seesaw and Jug Band Blues, like the second track, like the second side off of this album, which is like, what are you doing? But Set Controls for the Heart of the Sun is just that space rock incarnate, and it's just and yeah, I mean, half the songs on here, it definitely has a little bit of a identity crisis, as Piper did, but I think it's a little bit more realized. Like, the songs are definitely more separated. Let There Be More Light, Set Controls, and Saucer Full of Secrets are on that trippy, experimental, let's just see what happens. And then we've got Syd Barrett stuff, like Remember a Day, Corporal Clegg, Seesaw, and Jug and Blues. It's fun. It's fun, and I like the fact that, okay, they're starting to suss out their identity here, and they're really playing into that. And this is where I start to get some hate, because I put this so low. Okay, The Wall. Let's talk about this behemoth. Not a fan. I'm just gonna come right out and say it. Not a fan. Now that doesn't mean I don't like it. There's a difference between not being a fan and not liking something. I do like this album and I do enjoy it. I mean, I have it twice in my collection. One is the original pressing and one is the re-release. But I think it's overrated. Yeah, I said it. It is a little bit overrated. And I know a lot of the like singles are found off of this album. Mother, Comfortably Numb, Another Brick in the Wall. Those songs are like the ones that if you stop somebody off the side of the street and ask, name me a Pink Floyd song, those are the ones they're going to give you. Problem is, those standout tracks detract from the overall concept of the album. Like, it feels like because this album is really meant to be listened to from start to finish, those singles almost like underappreciate the album a little bit. My favorite tracks are the ones that you'll never hear on the radio, like The Trial, like Nobody's Home, like On Thin Ice. Like, these are the ones that I love, and yet you'll never hear them on the radio. So it's a little bit of a drawback, and also the concept is a little bit of a mess. They really should have just stuck to the one concept instead of doing a little bit of everything. Like, it's a guy grieving from his father dying in a war. It's a musician that doesn't quite know how to connect with his audience. It's that isolating wall that we put up to further ourselves from others. And sure, the concept of the wall is the thing that's unifying all these different concepts, but because this is more of like a narrative story, like a narrative flow, because it's tackling so many different things, I don't know if it's really like unifying them all that well. Like, we do have that unifying theme of the wall, but they should have just tackled it with either the band not knowing how to connect with their audience, with this guy's isolation from society. They should have just kept it with that. They shouldn't have incorporated all this war effort stuff going on. Like, Bring the Boys Back Home. I'm just like, what the hell does that have to do with anything that's going on here? Like, it didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And I think this album gets too much praise without too much thought. Now, that's my own little gripe with The Wall. It's still a great piece of art, and it's part of the reason why I have it twice in my collection, but I do have some gripes with it, and it's not the best album that they've done by far, so that's why I keep it at this point in the list. Let's move ahead. Again! Oh, I'm gonna get some hate for this. Okay, The Division Bell, 100% underrated. This guy is one of the best Pink Floyd albums ever released, and yet it doesn't get the love that it deserves. Just with that first track really opening it up, being that airy, light-sided things, and then we come right into What Do You Want From Me? Just like gushing track. It's got that same kind of makeup that we had from like Welcome to the Machine and Have a Cigar and Time and Money. Like it took a lot of what really worked and really solidified it here. Oh, there's so many good tracks off of this album that I don't even have memorized. Pulls apart and coming back to life. There's so many just amazing songs off of this album. Keep Talking, Lost for Words. So good. And yet it gets lost in the shuffle. Now, I will admit it's definitely more of a David Gilmour album, and it does follow suit a little bit with that Momentary Lapse of Reason. Like, if, say, The Wall and The Final Cut were Roger Waters' projects, then this is definitely David Gilmour's projects. And where Momentary Lapse of Reason was much more of a David Gilmour album, this one, much like The Wall, is still a David Gilmour project, but there's a lot more inclusion, right? Like, Richard Wright is back, and he is full force on this piece, and you guys need to check it out. If you haven't listened to it for a while, give it another spin, because it is just brilliant. Okay, so I might have oversold the Vision Bell. That's not saying that the rest of these guys aren't brilliant. Metal, the next one on here. It holds one of my favorite songs off the group, and that is Echoes. A brilliant, brilliant piece. It really solidified that epic song. But some of the other tracks on this are really fantastic. And it's also the crossroads. Like, this is the watershed for them. This is the album that I feel broke from the early Floyd to the mid Floyd, and this is that transition piece. Like, they still have a foot in the past with a lot of these songs, but they're looking to the future, and that's one of the reasons why I really like this album. And it is a transitional album, and one that is just, it's fantastic. Okay, coming into the final stretch, Animals. I love this album. It is one of my favorite albums. Structurally and conceptually, I think it is the most realized album. Dogs being that like 17-minute brilliance, Sheep and Pigs, Three Kinds, and then Pigs on the Wing, kind of bookmarking the album. I like how the band was able to approach this with a very clear-cut concept of humans are just political animals, and that animals being like the metaphors for the different kind of human facets that we have, and a very negative one when we apply it to political ideologies and politics in like the workforce, politics in life, politics in like the economical stance. And it's really, really a brilliant album. It's also probably their darkest album as well, and there are a few points where I'm like, I think you might be going a little too far with this, but I don't diss them for that. There's also very few really like rocking moments on this, which serves a little bit to its downgrade. Like, as much as I love Dogs, there's no real like oomph. The only ones that I have are the ending of Sheep, where it's that like cascade of sound. Fantastic album, and I can't help but love it. Okay, so yeah, I was going back and forth as to what would be my second and third choice on here, because they keep wish-washing, and I think I've hit it. I think I finally nailed it down, and I love Dark Side of the Moon. It is the one that put them on the map. Like, this was their breakout album, more so than any other album. I mean, it was on the top 10 Billboard chart for the longest time. You see the prism on t-shirts left, right, and center, and it's just a brilliant concept and very, very well fleshed out. The thing is, like, the concept does get a little bit muddled. Like, it is essentially just a concept of life. What does everything mean? What is everything? And it has those staple tracks, like You've Got Time, Got Money, Breathe, and the closing pieces of Brain Damage and Total Eclipse. I cannot listen to that closing piece without getting physically moved. And I just turn everything off and I just drift away when we get into that. And it's just, it's so powerful. There's a reason why this is their most critically acclaimed and accessible piece. And I love just how unified and a masterpiece this album is. So as I said, I've been kind of going back and forth as of which one I wanted as the third entry and which one I wanted as the second entry. And Wish You Were Here won out just for how brilliant and moving and heartfelt this guy was. Again, like Dark Side of the Moon, like The Wall, like Animals, this is a concept album. It's what the cost of fame is. I mean, this is the perfect follow-up album to that masterpiece of Dark Side of the Moon. So many albums fluster and don't know what to do once they broke that mold, like once they break through. And they did it perfectly with Wish You Were Here, as almost like a big FU to the musical industry of like, okay, we've got success, but do we really deserve it? Do we really need it? And it's also looking back at Syd Barrett, who had, at this point, just, I mean, unfortunately, lost his mind. And you hear that within the lyrics and within the songs here. Like, Shine On You Crazy Diamond is just a huge ode to him. And it's gushing with brilliance. And I know I'm going to say that a lot when I'm talking about this album. Like, the first 2 minutes are just that soundscape, and that was a really big risk for the band to do after such a brilliant album of Dark Side of the Moon. But you also have that single of Wish You Were Here, and it's one of the most requested songs from the band, and they play it endlessly. So good, so good, so good. So let's move on to number 1. Okay, so a lot of people are going to be wondering why this is here, and I've already kind of covered it. I did a full live stream of me talking about this album and why it's my number 1, so I've left that there. So I'm not going to go too deep into why this is number 1 for me, but the title track alone of Atom Heart Mother is a masterpiece. It is my favorite Pink Floyd track. It's my favorite Pink Floyd album. Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast is just a brilliant experiment of what it is to just go into these kinds of things. I cannot help but love it. It's got Fat Old Son that's being played, If, and Summer of 69, I believe it is. Summer of 67, Summer of 69. Yeah, it's my favorite album from them. As I said, I've already talked about it a lot within my live stream. I've already talked about it within my top 10 tracks from Pink Floyd. I've talked endlessly about this album. I can't help but love it. Go out and listen to it, because Atom Heart Mother is just, it's a masterpiece in its own right. And I can't help but love it. So, there we go. There's my worst to best of Pink Floyd's albums. What are your own list of Pink Floyd's albums? Let me know of those by commenting down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. You guys are definitely the best. I've been having a lot of fun doing this. It does take me a little bit longer to do, so don't expect these quite as often as, say, like my full-on reviews or my other kind of real talks. But, again, they're a lot of fun. I love doing them, and I'm not going to stop. So, I've already got a number of lists, and I'm going to just re-listen to a lot of the albums to make sure that they are in the right place. So, look out for those in the future. Again, thank you guys so much for watching. You guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.